what exactly or how would you define human trafficking? That's like the first part of it. The second part I would want to know is like, what relationship human trafficking plays in regards to class. I know we've talked about poverty, but I mean, when we talk about class, you know, there are people who can afford it, or there are people who cannot afford it, but they still do that. So what relationship human trafficking plays in regards to class? If I'm being clear, I don't know. I guess.
What do you mean by class? You mean socioeconomic class?
Could be socioeconomic class, could be, you know, when we talk about class, we normally compare people with like, you know, their income level or maybe their living style and maybe, you know, how they live their life compared to the people. So human trafficking, you've seen that, and I've seen that in my life with like people who are rich, can afford it, can afford to buy people to have sex. And I've heard stories of people who cannot afford it, who doesn't have enough money, but they still do it.
Well, I don't really know a whole lot about that, but I do know that there is, when I was in a conference on human trafficking, and the speaker who's done a lot of research on this, he actually writes, Siddharth, he actually writes about the business of sex slavery in sex trafficking, he calls it that. So he actually talks about if the price is high enough, you can decrease trafficking. And I just want to kind of throw the idea out there that not paying for sex doesn't necessarily mean people are being trafficked, right? I think so. There's a difference between prostitution and trafficking. And there are some parts of the world that you can, I mean, Siddharth Kara talks about being offered a woman for $2.50 in India. And he's like, well, everybody can afford that, right? So when you have an abundance of vulnerable people, then you can, you know, it's just numbers. You can sell people for really cheap. So I don't think it's necessarily about like if the price is low enough, if the price is low enough, but when there's like economic hardship, that's just actually one of the things that men don't pay for, at least in the case of men, that he's done research for. So that's a kind of what I know about that. And I don't remember your first part of the question.
What is human trafficking, or how you define it exactly? Because that's how I was relating it towards like, well, I mean, we do count that, you know, having sex for money as like a human trafficking kind of part.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not necessary.
It's not necessary, and then that's why I was like,
there's actually like a federal definition, so we can go ahead and leave it to it.
But definitely, that's a huge problem actually in terms of the policies, especially transnational policies. There's no really agreement. That is a huge problem. It has been, and just how we really have to fight in more like in transnational coalition. And then I have to say, we have to really differentiate between domestic human trafficking and international human trafficking. They're totally different to me. And when I talk about international human trafficking, we really have to have those different nations cooperate with each other. But it's not really happening much because of all the different definitions. The one definitions of human trafficking on American policy, TBPA, is totally different from the definition of human trafficking from the United Nations policy. So that's also a big problem. We really have to talk about this definition on a bigger scale.
So to your first question, the definition of human trafficking, like all of the countries who have ratified CEDAW, that's one of the convention against elimination of all form of discrimination for women. So we have ratified that. We follow the UN definition, which says human trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, harboring of the person. So it involves the buying and selling of the person, and that is by deception, or it also talks about forced labor, and it talks about sexual exploitation. Meanwhile, it also talks about the removal of organs. So to your question, like human trafficking now has a wide dimension. Like it not only talks about sex, or it not only talks about sex trafficking, but we also need to think about the organs being removed from your body. You are trafficked because people are in need of blood from your body. They are in need of skin from your body. As I was discussing, I said that these days people traffic girls or boys because they need skin out of their body for cosmetic surgery. So there are different types of like trafficking. So talking about the economy or talking about socioeconomic class, what I can say is like, yes, people are sold for money. So there are two factors, like there is a person who buys and there is a person who sells. So a person who sells a person is because he wants money. And he does that very, very easily. Like if you see the examples, most of the traffickers are somebody you know, somebody you trust. So they are not strangers. We think that traffickers are strangers, but actually they are somebody you know. So they sell people for money, and they sell their organs for money. So, and as she was mentioning, like it's like in different ways, it's a cheap thing to buy. Like even poor people can buy sex. So if you think human trafficking from only the perspective of sex trafficking, the context might be different. But if you look it from different other dimensions, like forced labor or organ trafficking, then the context is different. But definitely the socioeconomic class, it does play a vital role. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think Raksha gave us a good intro. Did anyone want to ask something? Oh, we have a question back there. Thank you. Okay.
So I have a more, I'm gonna move some behind the cameraman, and specifically for Mr. Snowden and anybody else who might be able to contribute. But so it's kind of an Oklahoma context, but it's a U.S. context, I suppose. In many ways, the National Day of Recognition for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women is in honor of my cousin Hannah Harris, who was found murdered, and it's on her birthday. So this is, for me, a very special panel because it's a very important issue for me. Having said that, I'm wondering in Oklahoma, because we just heard a man talking from an FBI unit during the Laramie Project, what type of jurisdictional issues that you face with the work that you're doing with trafficking, because we know with our Native communities, it's rampant. So I know I'm working with a unit up in Montana in my home community, but we have our bounded reservations. And we know that all of the traffickers, almost universally, are of course Americans trafficking Native women. And as everybody's been speaking, it seems to me that it would be exceptionally complex in Oklahoma with the ways that the reservations have been broken up, with the entire state being a reservation, but having this checkerboard pattern across the state, where how does the state work with the State Department and with local law enforcement to get at these issues? Because it's also one of the few states I've seen that has all of this information in bathrooms, and they're educating people. Whereas in Montana, they have state legislation that allows us to teach in our schools about prevention of human trafficking, which is new and many people aren't doing it, but they don't do any of the things that all of you have been doing to raise awareness.
So the good news is it's not near as complicated as you think. We are state agents, which means we encompass everything in the state, and we are cross-designated with the tribal police. So I have jurisdiction on tribal land. So does the FBI, and so does the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Where we run into a few issues is not with the major tribes, the Chickasaws and the Cherokees, the tribes with money, right? Where we run into some issues are some of the very, very small tribes who struggle financially, and because of that, guys, I don't know any other way to talk, so just float with it. Because of that, they have less than quality trained tribal police who ignore a lot of social issues within the tribe. It's not politically advantageous to them to point it out that there's a problem, and they may not have the training and awareness ability to reach out for resources. But overall, in the state of Oklahoma, yes, we have a tremendous amount of tribal land, tribal sovereignty, and we partner very well with them in not just in human trafficking, but with all criminal justice issues. We have trained some of their court personnel, some of their, for lack of a better word, probation and parole sort of correctional people. So it works out very, very well. The very first sort of organized operation that we did was in Thackerville, where jurisdiction was not a problem because we had not only the Chickasaws, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs with us. The one time we ever ran into trouble, and I promise I'll shut up, was a casino. It's the most fascinating Indian jurisdiction place I've ever seen in my life. You go into Missouri, turn around back into Oklahoma, take a right into Kansas, go through a truck stop parking lot, which is in Kansas, and then the casino itself is back in Oklahoma. So we had a case there where we had 1, 2, 3 state, 2 tribes, and BIA all involved in one investigation, and it worked beautifully. So we prosecute those through the federal, through the U.S. Attorney's Office, which we also have jurisdiction with in the 3 U.S. Attorney's offices in Oklahoma. So it sounds complicated, but it works very, very well. I wish I could say other states had a similar sort of system. I know Minnesota struggles with that in particular. Anybody want to address the neighbor? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's impressive. Holly, I don't know much about that at all either, but one of the things that we found out while we were doing a student and I were doing the research about what are resources around Oklahoma for human trafficking victims, and when she would call the Native organizations, there were a lot of resources for the victims within the reservation. So I knew that existed, so for what is worth.
I have a question over
I've been lucky enough to attend some of the meetings this past 3 days, so thank you to the Human Relations Department for hosting this, as well as the rest of you that are from different departments here. So I learned a lot, thank you. We talked about poverty and things like that. I come at it from the human rights angle, and I'm glad Mr. Snowden used that phrase, because it makes more sense to have, not to have support. That really makes a huge difference, and I think it works worldwide. Any member of community that feels like they have nobody, whether it's family, whether it's the immediate government, to go to for help, to kind of live a dignified life, they'll do anything. And the best, worst example we can look at is the issue of opioid crisis here. These are people, good old Americans, and maybe, and all of them have been middle class at some time, but the minute they feel like there's not any support for them, they'll go for the only thing that will somehow kill the pain. And I think when we look at worldwide issues, issues of fair exchange, people being paid well, governments being able to help people out when they're in need. These are just some of the comments that came to mind, some of the thoughts that came to my mind when he said that, and I appreciate him mentioning that because it makes more sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so, oh, you have a question?
Yeah.
Hi, with all of you, I'm sure you can answer this. Since you work to advocate against human trafficking, it's a very emotional and difficult issue. How do you take care of yourselves in order that you can sustain your work in a way that doesn't dampen your empathy or create detachment, but also where you can be in it for the long run?
So this is an interesting topic. And I appreciate the question because it acknowledges what I think a lot of us who do this work sometimes have a shame of acknowledging within ourselves, which is, this is really freaking hard. And something I've learned, and I've been engaged in government relations and advocacy for several years, but in women's issues specifically for the last year and a half. Prior to that, I was a missionary's kid, so I'm no stranger to ugliness and kind of just the worst parts of life and the worst parts of human nature. However, there's something very unique about being in a position to advocate for your own personal passions that feels like such an honor and such a privilege that to complain or that to say, I don't know if I can do this because it's just so hard, feels selfish. But it's important to acknowledge that when you have to make space within yourself for the knowledge, for the awareness of the dark side of these issues and the realities of the world we live in, it changes you. It becomes a part of, it becomes woven into the tapestry of who you are. And that can distort that goodness and that passion. It can drain it and kind of suck the life out of you, quite honestly. I like to think of it as the difference between like red hot anger, where you're just like this flame that's just, you know, like scorching, and then you just kind of fizzle out. So it's like that emotional roller coaster. And it's so easy to fall into that cycle when you hear the stories and when you watch documentaries like what we just watched. It's so abrasive. It's such a shock to your system. And it's so instantly enraging that, you know, that kind of turns into that red hot anger. I think the key for me personally, I'm a very passionate person. I mean, this is my life's work. I'm paid a nonprofit salary. Like, I'm not in this for the money. I don't deal with a bunch of white men in the legislature for fun. But I've tried to translate that red hot anger into white anger, like kind of smoldering, simmering, just kind of like the coals that keep me going. And every now and then I have to stoke them and kind of, you know, fire myself back up a little bit. But I think it's carrying those stories, the faces of the women that are impacted as this just underlying drive. And refusing to allow things to be said or decisions to be made without using my voice to speak on behalf of those whose voices were stripped from them. I don't know how else to say other than it just kind of becomes a part of you, and you just kind of make space for it. And then of course you learn where your lines are and where your boundaries are, and you learn to turn Twitter off, and you learn to stop drinking wine when you're sad. And you learn to, you know, you learn where those, like, I'm in the danger zone. And unfortunately for me, I have to get to the danger zone before I learn what, you know, where those lines are, but you learn them. And I think what I have learned, another thing that I've learned, is the value of not isolating yourself. One of my favorite things about this work is the amazing ability to meet people like this, to know that the weight of the world and all of women's issues in Oklahoma, it's not on my shoulders alone. There are amazing, engaged, intelligent, passionate men and women across the state, and across the country, and across the world who are fighting this fight alongside me. And so my job is to know where my weaknesses are and where their strengths are, and where we overlap and how we can empower and support one another. And I've just gotten really comfortable with telling the truth about how I'm doing. So people have stopped asking me, because I will say, I'm actually really tired. I'm really stressed. I'm so sick of people telling me that we can't do anything about this issue in Oklahoma. Why is it working everywhere else? Why can't we fix it here? And they're like, okay, well, good to see you, Liz. Nice chatting. I'm gonna go ahead and go get my coffee now. So you find those relationships, and you find the people that you can be frank with, that you can be real with, that you can talk about it with. One of my favorite interactions I had recently was with Jerry Askins, and I tell this with her permission. She is awesome, but I said I had a particularly hard week, and I was meeting with her, and I said, pardon my French, I said, this shit is just really, really hard. And she looked at me and she's like, honey, take a laxative and just keep working. And of course, like, she just laughed and kind of kept going on, but it was that, like, yeah, of course it is, but the world needs us, our state needs us, our state needs you, our state needs me. Just shut up, smile, and, you know, get up the next day and do it all over again, so.
Just to add up. Because yeah, this is the question we get often, like how do you put up or how do you make up for yourself? So it's like the same story that destroyed you will be the same story of strength that will energize you. Actually, the smile in their face, I mean, when you go to the rehabilitation homes, when you see them, when you talk with them, that's something that helps you re-energize yourself and then get all set to fight for this cause. So yeah, of course, apart from this, we need different sessions, like we organize programs like Care for Caretakers, some retreats and relaxation camps, because it is must. We hear different stories that are really difficult. We see cases where it's very difficult, but what keeps us moving is the satisfaction that we at least helped one person to be out of the problem, and now he or she is living a dignified life in the society. So that is something that keeps us moving. Thank you.
Because I teach in school social work, I always tell my students who's going to be social worker, I said, please, we call it this self-care. Please just have some kind of time for your self-care once a week. It's really easy to just get involved in what you're involved in it. And I know they're all motivated to help people, but they have to help themselves first. If you do not know how to help yourself, you cannot help others. That's what I always tell my students. Plus, also when you help vulnerable populations, one example, I've been working with the refugee population in Dallas, but it's hard. Every day we have to work on hard issues, but every now and then just you get one client come back to me and said how her life changed so much because of what I did. Probably that could be 1 out of 100 people, but that's really good enough reward for me to move on to the next 100 people.
Thank you.
I actually want to ask a question from the filmmaker. I watched the movie. I could really not watch the whole thing at once. I mean, and I have seen, as you might imagine, a ton of movies on human trafficking. So the question that you asked about self-care, it's really just, it's heart-wrenching. I've been doing research on human trafficking for 15 years, and I still literally cannot read the whole book or watch a whole movie all the way through. So I wanted to kind of ask you about, while you were making this, while you were going through the process, and you're actually meeting people who trafficked people, or talking about these really personal experiences, how, like, what was it like for you? Like, how is it how can you reach across the table to those? And I know you talked a little bit about that, but could you say more about it?
It's hard to look them in the eye and hear their stories. First thing is we establish trust. And so what I did was I shared my own personal story with them and put myself in a vulnerable place. And I told them that, you know, feel free to share whatever you need to share. But through my own healing and strength and practices to get myself strong, that's what I was trying to remind them of. That as a result of doing the interview, that you're inspiring other people.